Hello, welcome to Prajim Technologies. I'm Venkat. This is part 51, Access Modifiers for Types. If you haven't watched parts 48, 49, and 50, I would strongly encourage you to do so before continuing with this session. In this session, we'll be learning about the access modifiers that can be applied for types themselves. In the previous session, we have learned the different modifiers that can be applied for type members. Now we know that in C# there are 5 different access modifiers. And from the previous sessions, we have already understood all these 5 different access modifiers can be applied for type members. But when it comes to types, you can only use public and internal access modifiers with types. Trying to use any other access modifier will generate a compiler error. Let's look at an example. And in order to understand internal and public access modifiers properly, we need two assemblies. Okay, so let's add 2 class library projects to this solution, and to do that, right click on the solution, add, and select new project. Select Visual C# as your programming language, and let's select class library as the project type, and I'm going to name this as assembly1 project. Click OK. That should create that project. Let's add another project. I'm going to call this assembly2 project. Click OK, and it should create another project. Now, within assembly1 in class1.cs file, I'm going to create a class called assembly1 class. And within this class, I'm going to have a print method. So public void print method. And what this method does, it just prints a message onto the console. So console.writeLine hello. Alright, so if you look at this code, we have this class, and this class access modifier is public. And from the slide we understood that with types you can only use internal or public access modifiers. What happens if I use any other access modifiers? For example, what happens if I use private access modifier on the type? If I do that, and if I try to build the solution, look at what happens. We will get a compiler error. And look at the error. It says elements defined in a namespace cannot be explicitly declared as private, protected, or protected internal. Now, what do we mean by elements defined in a namespace? Now, what are the different elements that can be defined within a namespace? We can define a class, we can define a structure, we can define an interface, delegates, etc. So all these are examples of types. Okay, so types can only have internal or public access modifiers. Trying to use any other access modifier will give compiler error. So if I convert this back to public, we will get no compiler error. So if I build this Control-Shift-B, shortcut for building a solution, on the status bar you can see build succeeded. So you can use public access modifier. Now what do we mean by public? If you mark a type as public, then obviously it will be available anywhere, no restrictions whatsoever. Alright, now let's try to access this class which is present in assembly1 in assembly2 project. Okay, and obviously to do that in assembly2 project we need to add a reference to assembly1 project. Okay, and to do that, just open the references folder, right click on that, add reference, select assembly1 project from the list, click OK, and you should see assembly1 being added there. Okay, so now let's go to class1.cs file of assembly2 project, get rid of this unnecessary using statements which we don't use. I'm going to call this class as assembly2 class so that the names will be clear. So within this assembly2 class, let's have another method, public void test, and within this method I'm going to create an instance of this class, assembly1 class. And to do that, assembly1, can you see that you see the namespace but not the class? So assembly1.assembly1 class, you can either use the fully qualified name or you can actually use the using statement. So using assembly1. So assembly1 class, and let's call it as instance, is equal to new assembly1 class. And on the instance, I can invoke the print method. So now I am able to access the type that is defined in assembly1 in assembly2. Okay, why? Because that's public, that's accessible anywhere, no restrictions whatsoever. So now if I build the solution, we get no compiler errors. So you see on the status bar, build succeeded. Okay, now let's go back to class1.cs file of assembly1. Instead of public, let's use internal access modifier. Now all I did here is change the access modifier from public to internal. Now we know that if a member is internal, then it will be available only in the containing assembly. And the same is the true even for types. If you mark a type as internal, then that type is available only within that assembly where it's defined. Trying to access that type outside of that assembly will generate a compiler error. Now we are using this assembly1 class, which is internal and which is present in assembly1 project in assembly2. And look at that, we already have that red squiggly lines indicating some sort of error. Okay, so if I try to build a solution, we should get about 4 errors, and all of them, look at that, assembly1.assembly1 class is inaccessible due to its protection level, which is very clear that you are not allowed to access that particular class outside of assembly1. So any internal member or a type defined as within an assembly can be only accessed within that assembly. Trying to access that outside of the assembly will generate a compiler error. Now to get rid of those errors, all you need to do is make it public, since public member is accessible anywhere. And if I try to build this now, all those errors should have gone and build succeeded. Now let's do another thing. Let's delete the access modifier altogether. Now I don't have any access modifier whatsoever. So then what is going to be the modifier? Now for types, if you don't specify an access modifier, the default will be internal. Okay, so if I build the solution now, we again get those 4 errors. Because why? If you don't specify the access modifier, the default will be internal. But on the other hand, if you don't specify an access modifier for a type member, then it will be private. In fact, this is actually an interview question. They will ask you in general in an interview, okay, what is the default access modifier for a type member in private? The default for types, if you don't specify one, internal. Okay, so just keep in mind, type members can have all of the access modifiers, whereas types can only have 2 access modifiers. For type members, if you don't specify an access modifier, the default will be private. For types, if you don't specify an access modifier, the default will be internal. And you can see that on the slide. So private is the default for type members, whereas internal is the default for types. Okay, and if you're not sure about the other access modifiers, private, protected, and protected internal, we have already covered that in the previous session, so please go check that session. Alright, on this slide you can find some resources for ASP.NET and C# interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.